Welcome to Hunter's Con. Let's get right into it and talk about the biggest dilemma that faces SecOps teams and honestly security teams in general, which is that trade off between defense and resilience. Now, to dig in, let's just agree to some terms. For the sake of this talk, you can use them differently elsewhere. When we talk about defense, we're going to talk about reducing the ability of adversaries to even exploit vulnerabilities. Right, so it's about thing about hardening, protecting your attack surface, anything in the nature of stop the adversary from showing up. And resilience is those activities that are post-attack, response and recovery. So an adversary does something to you, how you react is resilience. They do something to you, how you keep them from doing the thing, that's defense. And we trade off as we think about all of our activities between these two. And often we're going to think about it like it's on a seesaw. It's like, well, we can invest in defense or we can invest in resilience. And what often happens is we like push on defense and we say, okay, we're going to focus on hardening. We're going to invest all of our energy on the development side of the house. We tend not to think about resilience as much, or resilience becomes a different group to worry about, and they're not really integrated. So, we sort of prioritize one, we overweight it, and we become weaker on the other side. Now, this can have some benefits. Like, you go roll out a zero trust program that's heavily focused on defense. And maybe people assume because we're well defended, we don't have to think as much about our resilience. Or we flip to the other side and we have a very DevSecOps heavy program, thinks about incident response. We've got great DFIR capabilities. Whenever something starts to happen, we react quickly, and it becomes easy to not focus quite as much on defense. And so this is the trade-off that people will tend to have in their mind. It isn't necessarily strictly true, but let's look at sort of how we might balance these and what those trade-offs look like a little tactically. So as we think about some activities in this space that are sort of more on the defense axis or more on the resilience axis, we might look at things like, say, zero trust, patching, logging, CI/CD. So all of these. So like zero trust, high on defense, low on resilience. Patching, there's a little bit of resilience in here, but it's still really focused on defense. And when we think about logging, and logging is really the root of so much of the SecOps discipline, it's actually kind of low on both the defense and the resilience scale. That's because logging alone doesn't provide us defense. It doesn't keep the adversaries out. And it doesn't do a lot for resilience, right? It's not what enables us to respond, it's what might enable other response activities. Now we think about our CI/CD system. And the more agile we are, the quicker we can make changes. Well, first, that enables defense. We can patch more quickly. We can roll out new software that protects us. And at the same time, when an adversary does something to us, we can respond more quickly, restore to a golden master, roll out a new defense that's going to get rid of our adversaries. When we think about backups, backups are a fantastic resilience as long as you know how to work them. I like to think of cloud as the ultimate backup. If all of your documents are stored in the cloud, Google Drive, Microsoft, whatever you're using, right? That gives you these sort of implicit backups that when you lose laptops, you don't lose data, right? So you're resilient against an adversary who might hit you with ransomware. And then DFIR is sort of that ultimate in the resilience activity. Very rarely defends us, but helps us recover, identify what adversaries have done, and get back to normal. And so here's a set of things we do in the SecOps arena, and there's obviously a lot more, but if I try to keep filling up this slide with them, at some point I'll get the hook. I'll be like, hey, get to the point, Andy. So after we think about these activities, it's really important for us to look and say, all of this is SecOps, but what are some specific disciplines? Let's talk about the people discipline. And in the history, we tend to think of developers focus on defense and operators focus on resilience. Right? And this is a really bad dichotomy. It's the waterfall model of the world sort of drove this, which said all that developers do is write software and then it gets deployed. And all that operators do is respond to problems. And so they don't really work together. And the evolution that we've had to create the DevOps model really says, no, it comes together. And my favorite way of forcing DevOps to really work is to say, when software breaks, when a system is no longer working, the incident response capability, what would normally have been the operators, should honestly be the developers. If at 3 a.m. your software stops working, I want to call and wake you up. Now, you might not actually be very helpful, but I still want to call and wake you up. Why? because I need this feedback. I need that resilience activity to drive defense. Like that's really the core of DevOps, is not saying, oh, let's protect the defenders, those developers, from having to engage in resilience. It's say, let's make sure that resilience activities create a cost on the defenders so that they will do better defenses, so we don't have to react. If somebody else gets to take that 3 a.m. phone call, you don't got any priority to fix the problem. If I call you every night at 3 a.m., you're going to very quickly prioritize fixing this problem. That's sort of the core of DevOps, is reducing that life cycle between resilience and defense. As we think about our processes, again, defense, we heavily focus on the release and the architecture process. How do we make sure our software really works? And often we prioritize safety here, and that pushes against the agile model that a lot of people want to go to, because release processes get so expensive that we can't afford for them to fail. On the flip side, we use incident processes to provide resilience, and incident processes have to be cheap. And the reason they have to be cheap is we don't get to control how many incidents we have. And so the more time you spend on one incident, the less time you have available for the next incident. So we tend to focus on how quickly can we get out of an incident, which honestly doesn't give us strong resilience. Over time, incident processes that don't mature will give us less and less resilience ability. And entertainingly, releases do the same thing. If we have a release process that becomes more and more heavyweight, well, that's actually going to reduce our defensive ability by reducing the bandwidth available to make defensive changes rather than product changes. And so we really want to bring these two together, and that's really where the CI/CD process often comes together, which is we do continuous development, continuous integration, so that our people who are injecting new changes can always be pushing them. But at the same time, when we need resilience, we have a quick and easy way to deploy changes, whether they're changes back to a good state or forward to a better state. And so the goal here is to say, how do I hit both of these with a process? And now very few security professionals tend to sit around and say, oh, CI/CD is like my number one tool for security, but it really is, because it gives you this integration between what were two processes that were driving in the wrong direction, and now we've motivated them to work together to drive in the right direction. Now let's think a little bit about technologies. Now, when we think about defensive technologies, what we tend to think about is things like the CSPM or ASPM or SSPM. Put any SPM now is this, which is security posture management, right? Technologies that say, oh, here's the list of things that you should do. Let me go check your architecture and see if you're doing those things. And I'll give you the list of what you should go fix. And these lists are massively long. In fact, most of the vendors in the space of CSPM, ASPM, et cetera, will tell you, we prioritize for you, like, what are the 5 things you should fix now out of the million? But the reality is there's a million things to get right, and it's hard for you to know which one. And the differentiators here over on this defensive side for technology is, how well do we understand your architecture? How can we connect the dots between 3 different hygiene problems to say this one became much worse because of the environment that it's in? And on the flip side, when we think about resilience, we tend to focus on SIM. And SIM is really just log aggregation in many places. Like, how do you pull in all of these logs of everything that's happened? So think about SPM as the logs of all of the things that are. SIM is all of the logs of things that are happening. And we'll say, oh, here's everything that just happened in your environment. Here's an alert that tells you an adversary might have just done it. Now, the challenge here, we see the same sort of pressures that we've seen elsewhere, which is, SPM technologies, while they're ostensibly for defense, because they have to prioritize, people get used to, oh, I've got this backlog of 5,000 things, so I'm not going to work on them. So they provide less and less defense over time. The same point, SIM, which is often focused more on detection, tends to drive away from full resilience and be less and less resilient over time. So how do we bring these two together when we think about technology to give us something better? And we really want to look about, how do we have platforms that combine this idea? It says, I know what's going on and I know what's happening. And I'm going to bring that together into a SOC platform so that I actually have this ability to provide resilience and defense in the same place. So that I can see what an adversary has done and tell you what needs to be fixed to prevent that from going forward. And at the same time, as I see an adversary doing things that look minor, I understand that those are not as minor. I take the same contextual information out of an SPM and apply that into what was a SIM, and make this better. So think of this as SIM next generation, SOC platforms, lots of different things in that space. Because ultimately, look, here's what our goal is we think about defense and resilience as being this trade-off, this seesaw. This is dangerous because you don't want to be in a world where a little bit more defense takes away from resilience. You'll start whipsawing back and forth. At some point, they both fall off the seesaw. Our real goal here is to do both. How do we sort of spread this fulcrum so that we can stably have defense and resilience as we're building out our defenses? So that's how we're going to approach defense versus resilience. Don't think of them as opposite sides of an axis. Think of these as both part of a bridge we're trying to build, and how do we deploy people, process, and technology that might give us both of them. So thank you very much. I hope this was really enjoyable for you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of HuntersCon.